The New Babylon, Chapter 15. Bryce ran the distance from the radio station on the ridge back to Arby's cabin. When he arrived, he briefed the team on the radio traffic he picked up, and everyone went into task mode. Bart set the radio in the back room to scan and placed the headset over his ears. Arby double-checked the trauma kit to make sure everything was in order. Pete went into the back and bolted the rear door and pulled the shades down. Johnny positioned himself in the dark room in the front of the cabin. He sat back from the window looking out over the driveway and the approaching road beyond. Bryce put the distance to the front door at approximately 500 meters to the spot he had chosen on the hill, and he knew that the modified AR-15 was easily within its effective capability at that distance. He was also confident that a shot at that range was well within his personal ability. Bryce began his career as a sniper in the Middle East in the original Desert Storm conflict. He was a long-range shooter assigned to a recon team operating in that region. In fact, later on in his career in Afghanistan in 2002, he made the record books with a shot that was just a few feet short of 2,800 yards. It was a classified op, and Bryce was prohibited from speaking about it in any way to anyone. Not being able to take credit for it never really bothered him. To Bryce, it was just another day doing a job, serving his country. Bryce was a true patriot. Now, as it was then, when the team had a situation that required Overwatch, it was a given that Bryce would fill that role. He opened the front closet and pulled out his rifle bag. He unzipped it and turned it over so that the felt sock, which held the Barrett 50 caliber rifle, was at the far side and lying on the bottom. He took out the smaller sock and peeled it back to reveal the Daniels Defense AR-15 rifle. The rifle was modified with an 18-inch bull barrel and a green reticle 4x32 ACOG scope. Bryce surveyed the area beforehand and already knew where he would set up in this circumstance. There was a good spot which provided both cover and concealment, just up the bank to the side of the cabin. It gave him a good vantage point of both the front and rear doors, as well as the barn and shed entrances, with the approach road beyond and also in good view. As Bryce set up position on that hilltop, he unpacked the rifle and attached the flash suppressor to the end of the barrel. He pushed 30 fresh rounds of MK212 Mod 1 77 grain hollow point boat tail 5.56 ammunition into the magazine and inserted it into the rifle. He touched the mic on his headset and said, "Overwatch is a go, copy?" Bart, who had turned the radio in the back room to the corresponding frequency, responded, "Copy, Overwatch." They were operating on a low bandwidth, line of sight channel, different from the frequency that Bryce picked up the traffic on earlier at the radio site. Bart dialed the radio in the comms room into the headset Bryce was wearing. He was confident that the bad guys would not have access to it. Bryce sat waiting in silent contemplation. He prayed to God for strength and discernment in this time. He prayed that there could be peaceful resolution to the conflict that would visit itself upon his threshold. He remembered the words from Psalm 154, as he always did when he prepared himself for that conflict. "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war, and my fingers to fight." Bryce opened his eyes as he heard the sheriff's department patrol car slowly making its way up the gravel road. It eased to a stop in front of the cabin. Bryce put his finger on the mic trigger on his headset. "Showtime, ladies." One vehicle containing 2 bogies, idling on the road at the end of the driveway. The response came back immediately. "Roger that, Overwatch." Then Bart relayed the info to the rest of the team. Johnny had exited earlier and set up in the woods off to the street side of the cabin. He was covering the blind spot of the Overwatch position in the event that they took cover over there if things went sideways. Pete was in the dark bedroom, peering out the window toward the stopped car. Arby was to the left of the rear door, covering it, and Bart was in the radio room, shotgun leaning against the control desk. The women and Arby's son were in the barn loft out back, concealed and under cover. Katie, Bart's wife, had the green laser from her AR-15 sitting squarely on the barn door. If it opened without her hearing the approach signal, whomever opened it would be dead before they stepped foot inside. As the 2 men exited the car, leaving it running in the road and slowly starting for the cabin, Bryce acquired his target, the man furthest from him in the ACOG. He thought to himself, "God, I pray I don't have to kill these 2 men tonight. But alas, not my will, but your will be done." Bryce really was tired of killing. He had seen enough of it to last 2 lifetimes. He was capable of it, good at it even. He was a very efficient killer when he needed to be, but he certainly did not enjoy it. He had seen men who did. He never understood that. He never could reconcile how a man can enjoy taking the life of another man. Yes, it was necessary sometimes, but it was never anything he could enjoy, never anything to be comfortable with. He took a deep breath and slowly exhaled it. The morning ferry from Ellis Island had come and gone. Kevin was not on it. Now, the late afternoon ferry was approaching the docks. Sarah watched it from the ventilation window in the old boiler room. Kevin had given her implicit instructions to leave at first light if he was not on this, the final ferry of the day. She watched as 2 armed men got off and went in another direction. Then she saw him. Her husband was pushed from behind, stumbled down the ramp, falling on the dock below. His hands bound behind him, his head and face stained with blood. The man who came off behind him pulled him to his feet by his hair. Sarah gasped. She had also received orders from Kevin to leave immediately if he came back with someone with him or following him. She had struggled with the idea of leaving without him if he wasn't on the ferry, but she reasoned that she would make contact with Jason on the trip home, and he would return with her to rescue Kevin. Those, however, were not Jason's orders. He was to get Sarah back to church safely, and then, and only then, return in an attempt to rescue Kevin. But now it was different. He was on the ferry, and he was in distress. She promised her husband that she would flee if indeed he was being followed. However, as she watched this stranger pulling her bloodied husband up by his hair, she could not leave. She opened the steel door halfway, and as the men approached, she took position behind it. She drew the knife that was sheathed at her side and held it in her right hand. Kevin had trained various combative techniques with his wife for countless hours. She knew how to kill efficiently with the weapon she now held in her hand. But her life had been devoted to healing others' suffering, not inflicting it. She prescribed to the oath to do no harm. It was more than a motto to her, it was a way of life. Still, she knew what she had to do. As the stranger pushed Kevin into and through the door, he tumbled, hands still bound behind him, and came to rest on the floor against the far wall. He noticed Sarah behind the door, but tried to avoid looking in her direction. Kevin's captor pushed the door open further and walked through it. Without hesitation, Sarah leapt up and onto his back, wrapping her left arm firmly around his muscular neck. She knew that if he was able to get his arms around her, she would be finished. He jerked around violently, discharging the shotgun he was holding as he did. The blast deafened Sarah, but just hit the ceiling, knocking loose some old plaster. Sarah tightened her grip on the man's neck. As he began to choke, he backed up, smashing her tiny body against the wall with his large frame. Sarah knew exactly where to insert the carbon steel blade of the survival knife. She slipped it easily into the jugular vein on the left side of the big man's neck. He squirmed a bit as blood projected out from the hole left by the knife. He began to wobble, and a few seconds later fell to the floor. He was dead before he hit the ground. Sarah stepped off of him and ran over to her husband. She cut the bands that tied his hand, and Kevin sprung into action. Sarah stood stunned for a moment before Kevin called her name. "Sarah, honey, we've got to go, quickly. We don't know where the other guys from the ferry went or how long it will take them to get here." They had to have heard the shotgun blast. She nodded, and still stunned, followed her husband out the door. As they cleared the side of the building and started for the road out toward Brooklyn, shots from a rifle rang out in the distance. They hit the building to Kevin's left, and he turned back, took aim, and returned fire, yelling to his wife to run for the cover of the buildings on the other side of the street across the lot. As she did, Kevin shot both men pursuing them in quick succession. He was pretty sure they were the only two on the ferry with him and the other man, but sprinted after his wife, not taking any chances. Once they were far enough away, they stopped under the L train to rest briefly before continuing on. Kevin held his wife to comfort her. She was visibly shaken. It was clear that killing that man in the boiler room, her first, was bothering her. Kevin, Will, Bryce, and Bart had all killed before during their various deployments. None of them liked it, but they all volunteered for that service knowing the risks, and also knowing that in the defense of themselves, their nation, and innocent civilians, they might be required to take lives. In that respect, they did so willingly. But for Sarah, it seemed different. She felt that she had no choice, that it wasn't up to her. When she saw that man with Kevin get off the ferry, she knew he would kill her husband when they got to the boiler room and it was empty. She knew someone was going to die at that point. Her only choice was to do all she could to make sure that it was not her husband who lost his life today. They sat in the cool dark of the night in silence. Sarah was reeling with emotion, trying hard to process what had happened. Days later, she would realize what her husband already knew. that she was no different from him and his teammates, that she did indeed make the same choice. When she insisted on going with Kevin, she did volunteer. She willingly decided to be part of this assignment, an assignment that would ultimately lead to her killing this man. She would come to realize that, in fact, that was the very reason why Kevin had resisted her going with him in the first place. Kevin knew that nobody planned to kill going in, that nobody really contemplated having to actually kill someone, or if they did, they didn't really understand what the impact of that would be. Kevin did understand that impact and the effects it would have, but Sarah insisted on being with him, and he understood that as well. He also understood that now, just like him, Will, Bart, and Bryce, she also owned this thing, this state of emotional and psychological being. He knew his wife was strong, but would she be strong enough? He knew what she was feeling and what she would feel in the days and weeks to come. He also knew there was very little he could do to help her process those feelings. So he just held her as he would for the rest of their lives together. Just then, Kevin heard footsteps approaching in the narrow tunnel leading out of the darkness beyond. He grabbed his rifle and pulled his wife to a point of concealment behind a concrete abutment. Together, they waited in silence as the footsteps drew closer.